Hello, and welcome to our channel. I'm so glad you've found your way here to our quiet little corner of the world. All you need to do now is breathe and listen. Let my voice be your guide as we drift away into tonight's story. On a summer morning, two young brothers selling eggs at their family farm's roadside stand in rural Kansas simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but an empty cash box and unanswered questions. For months, their parents endured accusations and sleepless nights, never knowing if their sons were dead or alive. But 3 years later, a hobbyist with a fishing magnet makes an unexpected catch in the local river, something that would expose a truth so disturbing it would shatter an entire community's sense of safety forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the vegetable garden as Eleanor Vance knelt between the rows of tomatoes, her worn gardening gloves already dirt-stained from an hour of pulling weeds. It was Tuesday, just past 9 o'clock, and the Kansas heat was already building, promising another scorching July day. She could hear the distant rumble of Robert's tractor in the far field, the familiar sound that had become the soundtrack of their 23 years of marriage on this farm. Eleanor paused to wipe sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across her skin when she heard the crunch of gravel from their long driveway. Looking up, she saw Sheriff Miller's cruiser approaching, followed by two unmarked vehicles she didn't recognize. Her stomach tightened instinctively. Police cars at a farm were rarely good news. She stood slowly, her knees protesting after kneeling for so long, and wiped her dirty hands on her faded jeans. Sheriff Miller had been a family friend for years, attending the same church, buying eggs from their roadside stand when the boys ran it. But as he stepped out of his cruiser, his face bore an expression she'd never seen before, a mixture of professional grimness and personal sorrow. "Morning, Eleanor," he said quietly as he approached. Two people in suits emerged from the unmarked cars, a man and a woman, both carrying themselves with the rigid posture of law enforcement. "These are Detectives Hayes and Chen from the state. Police, we need to speak with you. Is there somewhere private we can talk?" Eleanor's mouth went dry. "What's this about, James?" She used his first name, hoping to break through the official facade, but he merely gestured toward the house. "Please, Eleanor, inside would be best." She led them through the back door into the kitchen, her muddy boots leaving prints on the linoleum she'd mopped just yesterday. The detectives waited until she'd pulled out chairs around the worn oak table before introducing themselves properly. Detective Hayes, the older of the two with graying temples, took the lead. "Mrs. Vance, there's no easy way to say this," he began, pulling out a tablet from his briefcase. "This morning, a magnet fisher found something in Redwood Creek. It was an old milk can, and when he pulled it up, he paused, glancing at Sheriff Miller, who nodded slightly. There were human remains inside. Small remains. We have reason to believe they may be your son, Leo." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her legs gave out, and she grabbed the edge of the kitchen table for support, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, that's not possible. Leo's out there somewhere. He and Daniel, they're just detective." Chen, younger, with sympathetic eyes, turned the tablet toward Eleanor. "I'm sorry, but we need you to look at these photos. Can you identify this milk can?" Eleanor forced herself to look at the screen. The image showed a weathered metal milk can, rust-stained and covered in river muck, but the marking was still visible. Vance Farms in faded letters with their farm's old logo. A simple drawing of a rooster that Robert's father had designed 40 years ago. "Oh God," Eleanor breathed. We had dozens of those before we switched to the modern cooling tanks. We sold most of them at a farm auction, but kept some in the old barn. I don't know how many." Hayes swiped to the next photo. Eleanor caught a glimpse of something wrapped in green tarp with white stripes before she had to look away, her stomach heaving. Small bones, so terribly small, and tattered fabric that might have been. "I can't," she gasped. "Please, I can't look at that." "The medical examiner will need to confirm through DNA," Chen said gently, closing the tablet. "But the remains are consistent with a child of Leo's age at the time of disappearance. The preservation in the sealed can means we should be able to make a positive identification." From outside came the sound of the tractor engine cutting off. Eleanor saw Robert jumping down from the cab, having spotted the police cars. He was running toward the house, his work shirt flapping behind him. He burst through the door, taking in the scene the officer's Eleanor's stricken face, and his expression shifted from confusion to dread. "What's happened?" he demanded. Eleanor, Sheriff Miller stood up. "Robert, you should sit down." "Tell me, standing," Robert said, but his voice wavered. The sheriff repeated the devastating news, each word seeming to age Robert years. He sank into the chair next to Eleanor, reaching for her hand. "Where?" he asked hoarsely. "Where?" "In Redwood Creek, near the old county bridge," Hayes answered. The can was wedged under some submerged logs. If not for the magnet fissure, it might never have been found. Detective Chen cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance, I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but we need to search your property. Specifically, we need to inventory any remaining milk cans and collect evidence." Robert's head snapped up. "Evidence? What kind of evidence?" Hayes's face was professionally neutral. "The milk can came from your farm. That makes this property a potential crime scene. We need to determine if the crime occurred here. You think we... ... Eleanor couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too horrific. "You think we killed our own son?" "We have to follow the evidence," Chen said. "I'm truly sorry, but we have a warrant." As if on cue, more vehicles began arriving. Crime scene technicians in white coveralls emerged with metal detectors, evidence bags, and cameras. Eleanor watched numbly as they spread across the property. She and Robert had worked so hard to maintain, treating their home like a crime scene. "I'm calling our lawyer," Robert said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He pulled out his phone and dialed Michael Edwards, the attorney who'd handled their farm's legal matters for years. Eleanor heard him explaining in clipped sentences, his voice breaking when he had to say, "Leo's remains." Within 20 minutes, Michael's sedan was speeding up the driveway. He emerged in his courtroom suit, all business, despite the rural setting. "Where's the warrant?" were his first words to the detectives. Hayes handed over the document. Michael scanned it quickly, his expression darkening. "You're treating my clients as suspects in their own son's murder, based solely on a milk can that could have been stolen from their property years ago." "Counselor, we have to investigate all possibilities," Hayes replied. "Your clients aren't under arrest. We are simply executing a lawful search warrant. And if we refuse to answer questions, that's your right, but we'd prefer cooperation." "2 boys are still missing." "1 boy," Eleanor interrupted, her voice hollow. "1 boy is still missing. Daniel, my baby. Daniel is still out there somewhere." And now she couldn't continue. Michael put a protective hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "My clients will cooperate fully with the search, but any questioning will be done with me present. And if you're planning to take them to the station, we'd like them to come voluntarily," Chen interjected, "to provide DNA samples for comparison and to give formal statements about the milk cans and who might have had access to them." "Absolutely not," Michael said firmly. "Not today. My clients just learned their son is dead. They need time to process this tragedy. Either arrest them with probable cause or leave them to grieve in peace." The detectives exchanged glances. Hayes nodded slowly. "We'll complete our search and be in touch, but we will need those statements soon." Eleanor watched the crime scene techs photographing their barn, their chicken coop, even the old root cellar. They were bagging soil samples, as if the earth itself might hold evidence of her son's fate. 3 years of not knowing, 3 years of hope against hope, and now this. Leo gone, found discarded in the creek like garbage, and the police treating them like suspects instead of grieving parents. "James," she said to Sheriff Miller as he prepared to leave, "you've known us for 15 years. You know we would never... "I know, Eleanor," he said quietly, pain evident in his eyes. "But I have to follow procedure. The state police are lead on this. I'm just..." He trailed off, then placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry about Leo, about all of this." As the sheriff walked away, Eleanor saw their neighbor's truck slowing at the end of the driveway, George Henderson craning his neck to see what was happening. The police cars, the crime scene tape being strung around their barn. By evening, the whole county would know their private tragedy was about to become very public. The police had been gone for nearly an hour, leaving behind yellow tape fluttering around the barn and the ghost of their presence in tire tracks across the lawn. Eleanor sat on the porch's weathered wooden swing, her body folded in on itself, while Robert stood rigid against the porch railing, staring out at their violated property. The evidence bags were gone, the photographer's flashes just a memory, but the weight of what had been revealed pressed down on them both. The rumble of George Henderson's old pickup truck broke through their shocked silence. Eleanor looked up to see their neighbor pulling into the driveway, his vehicle kicking up dust in the late afternoon heat. George had been their neighbor for over 20 years, his property line running along theirs for nearly a mile. He'd been a good friend through all those years, the kind of neighbor who'd show up to help during harvest without being asked, who'd check on their animals when they took their rare vacations. George's face was already etched with genuine concern as he climbed out of his truck. At 62, he moved with the careful gait of a man who'd spent his life doing physical labor, his joints reminding him of every fence post driven and hay bale lifted. As he climbed the porch steps, Eleanor could see the worry deepening the lines around his eyes. "Eleanor, Robert," he said, removing his farm supply cap. "I saw all the police cars from my east field. Must have been a dozen of them. What, in God's name, happened?" Eleanor tried to speak, but found her throat closed with emotion. Tears she'd been holding back since the police left suddenly spilled over. Robert moved to her side, his hand on her shoulder, and answered for them both. "They found him, George. They found Leo." George's weathered face went white with shock. "Found him? Where? How?" "In Redwood Creek," Eleanor managed to say between sobs. "A magnet fisher pulled up an old milk can this morning. Our milk can. He was ... He was inside." George's legs seemed to give out, and he sat heavily in the wicker chair across from them, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles went white. "Dear Lord," he whispered. "Oh, Eleanor, Robert, I can't imagine what you're going through." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "When I lost my son in that farming accident, it nearly killed me. But at least," he paused, swallowing hard, "at least I got to bury my son, got to say goodbye. You've spent 3 years not knowing what happened to your boys, and now this." Eleanor noticed how George's hands trembled slightly as he spoke about his son. His son had been 24 when the accident happened 5 years ago. A young man just starting to take over more responsibility on the farm. The grain silo had malfunctioned, and he had suffocated before anyone could reach him. She remembered attending the funeral, how George had stood alone at the grave after everyone else had left, his shoulders shaking with grief. His wife had left him the year before his son died, unable to handle his drinking problem that had developed after a bad harvest. nearly bankrupted them. The police, George said, pulling himself back to the present. All those crime scene people. They don't think you... ... They do, Robert said bitterly. The milk can came from our farm, so we're suspects. They're treating us like we killed our own son. George's face flushed with indignation. That's insane. Anyone who knows you, how could they even think such a thing? They have to follow the evidence, Eleanor said hollowly, repeating the detective's words. The evidence that says someone put our baby in our milk can and threw him in the creek like trash. The late afternoon sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful any other day. George looked at them both, then stood with decision. You shouldn't be alone right now, he said firmly, and I know you're in no state to think about the animals. I'll handle the evening feeding. I know where everything is. George, you don't have to, Robert started, but George cut him off with a raised hand. It's what neighbors do. Besides, I know exactly what needs doing. Those horses need their grain. The chickens need to be locked up for the night. And that old mare of yours, Daisy, right? She needs that special feed for her teeth. Eleanor managed a weak smile. Despite everything, George did know their farm almost as well as they did. He'd helped them enough times over the years, and they'd returned the favor just as often. Your feed delivery is scheduled for tomorrow morning, isn't it? George continued. I can be here to receive it if you need to be dealing with ... with funeral arrangements or legal matters. The word funeral hits Eleanor like a physical blow. They would have to bury their son, plan a service, pick out a coffin small enough for the remains that had been crammed into a milk can. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. George moved around their property with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been there countless times. Eleanor watched from the porch as he headed to the bar, not the one wrapped in crime scene tape, but the newer one where they kept the feed. He knew exactly which barrel contained the chicken feed, which bags were for the horses. He even remembered that Daisy needed the senior feed with added supplements for her aging teeth and joints. As he worked, moving between the chicken coop and the horse pasture, Eleanor found herself grateful for his presence. The routine of farm chores, even performed by someone else, provided a tiny bit of normalcy in a day that had shattered their world. George was just closing the chicken coop door, having made sure all the hens were safely inside for the night, when another vehicle turned into their driveway. This one moved faster than George's careful approach, gravel spraying as it braked hard near the house. The logo of our channel on the van's side made Eleanor's stomach drop. Reporter Alex Riley jumped out before the van had fully stopped, his cameraman right behind him, already hoisting his equipment onto his shoulder. Riley was young, maybe late 20s, with perfectly styled dark hair that seemed impossibly maintained in the rural Kansas heat. His eyes lit up when he saw Eleanor and Robert on the porch. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, he called out, hurrying toward them with his microphone. Alex Riley, from our channel news. Could we have just a moment of your time about this morning's discovery? No, Eleanor said immediately, standing up. Please leave. This is private property, and we're asking you to go. But Riley was already at the bottom of the porch steps, his cameraman's lens trained on them. I understand this is difficult, but the public deserves to know. Robert put his hand on Eleanor's shoulder, a gesture that could have been comforting or restraining. We can answer a few questions, he said quietly. Eleanor looked at him in surprise, but saw something in his eyes. Maybe the need to have their side heard, to push back against the narrative that was already forming. Riley's professional smile widened. Thank you. First, can you confirm that human remains found in Redwood Creek have been identified as your son, Leo? The identification isn't official yet, Robert said carefully. But yes, we've been told the remains are likely our son's. And the milk can they were found in. that came from your farm. Eleanor saw the trap immediately, but Robert had already nodded. We had many of those cans years ago. We sold most of them. Riley's expression shifted, becoming harder, more predatory. Do you care to comment on the accusations that you murdered your own son? The words hung in the air like poison. Eleanor felt her knees go weak again. What accusations? Robert demanded. Who's making accusations? Sources close to the investigation say you're being treated as suspects. That police searched your property. For evidence, Riley pressed closer. Where are you hiding the second boy, Mr. Vance? Where is Daniel? How dare you? Eleanor gasped. How dare you come here? And is it true you took out a large life insurance policy on both boys just months before they disappeared? Riley continued relentlessly. That you were having financial troubles with the farm? Get off our property, Robert said, his voice dangerously low. Now Riley held his ground for another moment, the camera still rolling. The public will draw their own conclusions from your refusal to answer, he said coolly, then finally gestured for his cameraman to lower his equipment. As the news van pulled away, Eleanor noticed George's truck had stopped at the end of their driveway. He'd been watching the entire encounter. After a moment, his truck slowly continued down the road, leaving them alone with the devastating realization that instead of being able to grieve their son's death in peace, they would now have to defend themselves against accusations of murder. By 7 o'clock, darkness was falling across the Kansas farmland, the last traces of orange sunset fading into deep purple. Eleanor and Robert had spent the past hour in silence, each lost in their own grief when George's truck rumbled back up their driveway. His headlights swept across the porch where they still sat, unable to move forward with any normal evening routine. George climbed out, his figure silhouetted against his truck's cab light. I've already taken care of your chickens and horses, he called out as he approached. Got everyone fed and watered, coops locked up tight. Thank you, George, Robert said, his voice raw from the day's emotions. We should pay you for ... Don't even think about it, George interrupted. Though I did notice your grain supply is running pretty low. The delivery tomorrow will help, but you'll need something for the morning feeding. I've got plenty in my barn. Why don't you come get a few sacks to tide you over? Robert started to rise. I'll go with you. No, Eleanor said suddenly, standing up. I'll go. When Robert looked at her with concern, she added, I need to do something. Anything. I can't just sit here anymore. Eleanor, you should rest, Robert protested. Today has been... I know what today has been, she said sharply, then softened her tone. Please, I need to keep my hands busy or I'm going to fall apart completely. Robert understood that need, the desperate desire to do something practical, something normal. When your world had been shattered, he nodded reluctantly. Eleanor climbed into George's truck, the familiar smell of feed dust and old leather somehow comforting. They drove the short distance to his property in silence, the truck's headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. George's barn loomed ahead, a massive structure that had stood for nearly a century, weathered but solid. Inside, a single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows across the packed dirt floor and equipment-lined walls. The barn smelled of hay and motor, oil, the sense of a working farm. George led her to the feed storage area, pointing out several 50 lb sacks of grain. This should get you through a couple of days, he said, hefting the first sack. Here, you get that end. Eleanor moved to help him, grateful for the physical task. They worked together to load the first sack into his truck bed, then returned for another. As George reached for the second bag, Eleanor's eyes wandered around the familiar space. That's when she saw it, a roll of green work tarp tucked behind an old cultivator. The distinctive white stripes were visible even in the dim light. The image from the detective's tablet crashed into her mind with violent clarity. the small form wrapped in that same green tarp with white stripes. The way the plastic had degraded after years in water, but still held its terrible secret. Her baby, her Leo, wrapped and discarded. ... The world tilted. Eleanor stumbled backward, her vision graying at the edges. She reached out blindly for support, but misjudged the distance, her head connecting hard with a low wooden beam. Pain exploded across her forehead, and she felt herself falling. Eleanor, George dropped the grain sack and rushed to her, catching her before she hit the ground. What happened? Are you all right? She touched her forehead, and her fingers came, away sticky with blood. A small cut, but head wounds always bled freely. The tarp, she managed to say, pointing with a shaking hand. It's the same ... in the photos, wrapped around ... Understanding dawned on George's face. He looked stricken as he helped her to an overturned bucket to sit on. Oh God, Eleanor, I'm sorry. I didn't think. Here, let me get that out of sight. He quickly moved to the tarp, rolling it up tighter and shoving it behind other equipment, where it couldn't be seen. When he returned, he had an old but clean rag in his hand, which he pressed gently to her forehead. I'm so sorry you had to see that, he said, his voice full of genuine remorse. I used those tarps for everything around. Here, covering equipment, lining the truck bed. I never thought about how it might, after what you saw today. Eleanor held the rag to her head, the sharp pain somehow grounding her in the present moment. It's not your fault. They sell those tarps at every hardware store in the county. It's just, seeing it brought it all back. George crouched beside her, his weathered face creased with concern. Maybe we should get you home. Robert will worry if we're gone too long. Eleanor nodded, suddenly exhausted. They loaded one more bag of grain in silence, George doing most of the work while keeping a watchful eye on her. As they prepared to leave, he turned off the barn light, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the truck's headlights. I'll get the rest of those tarps out of here tomorrow, George said quietly as he helped her into the truck. Won't have anything around. That might remind you. Back home, Robert immediately noticed the blood on Eleanor's forehead as she walked through the kitchen door. His exhausted face shifted to alarm as he jumped up from the table where he'd been sitting with his head in his hands. What happened? He moved to examine the cut, gently tilting her face toward the light. I'm fine, Eleanor said, though she let him guide her to a chair. I hit my head on a beam in George's barn. It's just a small cut. Robert retrieved the first aid kit from under the sink, the same one they'd used countless times for the boys' scraped knees and minor injuries. His hands were gentle as he cleaned the wound with antiseptic, though Eleanor winced at the sting. How did you hit your head? He asked, applying a small bandage. Eleanor hesitated, then explained about seeing the green tarp with white stripes, how it had triggered the memory of the evidence photos. Robert's jaw tightened as she spoke, his movements becoming more rigid. Those photos, he said quietly. I can't stop seeing them either. Our baby, ... wrapped in plastic, like ... He couldn't finish. They sat in silence as he put away the first aid supplies, both lost in the horror of what had been done to their son. By 8 o'clock, Robert had moved to the couch, saying he just needed to rest his eyes for a moment. Within minutes, the emotional exhaustion of the day had pulled him into a deep sleep. Eleanor watched his face relax, the lines of grief temporarily smoothed away. She covered him with the quilt her mother had made years ago, the one the boys used to fight over during movie nights. Eleanor returned to the kitchen table, but couldn't bring herself to eat. The casserole their church friend had dropped off that afternoon sat untouched in the refrigerator. Her stomach churned at the thought of food. Instead, she sat with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, her thoughts spiraling into dark places. Someone had killed her baby boy. Someone had taken Leo, and she forced herself to confront the reality, cut him up to fit inside that milk can. The medical examiner had been clinical about it during their brief phone consultation, talking about dismemberment and preservation conditions. But all Eleanor could think about was her son's small body, how someone had done such unspeakable things to fit him into that metal container. The house felt oppressively quiet. By now, the boys would have been getting ready for bed. There should be the sound of water running upstairs as they brushed their teeth, arguments about whose turn it was to set the table for breakfast, the soft murmur of Robert reading bedtime stories. Leo had loved the adventure books, always asking for just one more chapter. Daniel preferred picture books about animals, making Robert do all the voices. Now there was nothing but the tick of the kitchen clock and Robert's soft snoring from the living room. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor caught sight of headlights moving along George's back access road, the dirt track that ran behind his barn and connected to the old county road. The lights stopped and went dark near his barn. George was probably doing his evening equipment maintenance, she realized. He'd always been a creature of habit, checking his machinery every night, making sure everything was ready for the next day's work. She thought about how George had maintained these routines even after losing his son. He'd told her once that the predictability of farm life had saved him after his son's death. The animals still needed feeding, the crops still needed tending, the equipment still needed maintaining. The rhythm of farm life didn't pause for grief. Eleanor glanced at Robert again. He was sleeping so deeply, more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. Today had aged him years in just hours. She couldn't bear to wake him, but her mind wouldn't stop, racing, circling around the funeral arrangements that would need to be made. They'd need George's flatbed trailer to transport chairs from the church for the service. Their own truck wasn't big enough, and George had always been generous about lending equipment. She could walk over and ask him now, while she knew he was in the barn, rather than burden Robert with one more task in the morning. The decision made, Eleanor quietly took her phone from the counter and slipped out the back door. The night was warm and humid, typical for July in Kansas. Crickets chirped in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The walk to George's property along their shared fence line was one she'd made countless times over the years. They'd worn a path through the grass from decades of neighboring borrowing tools, sharing equipment, helping with harvests. Tonight, she used her phone's flashlight to navigate the bright LED beam cutting through the darkness. As she walked, Eleanor tried not to think about how Leo and Daniel had loved to visit Uncle George, always excited to see his barn cats and the old plough horse he kept more as a pet than for work. They'd felt safe on his property, just as safe. As at home the barn loomed ahead, a thin line of light visible under the main door. Eleanor could hear the faint sound of metal on metal. George working on something, keeping his hands busy, just as she needed to keep hers busy. 10 minutes after leaving her house, she reached for the barn door handle. Eleanor pushed open the barn door, the hinges creaking softly in the night air. Inside, George was hunched over his workbench, the kerosene lantern casting dancing shadows. Across the walls, tools were spread before him as he worked on what looked like a carburetor. The smell of machine oil and old hay filled the space. At the sound of the door, George looked up, startled, the wrench in his hand clattering to the concrete floor. His eyes were wide with shock, clearly not expecting anyone at this hour. Eleanor, he straightened quickly, wiping his hands on his coveralls. What are you doing here? Is everything all right? I'm sorry, Eleanor said, suddenly feeling foolish for the late visit. I saw your lights on and thought, am I disturbing you? No, of course not, George said, though he seemed to be composing himself, his initial shock fading into his usual neighborly demeanor. He picked up the fallen wrench and set it carefully on the bench. Just doing some maintenance. Can't sleep sometimes. So I come out here and work. Keeps the hands busy, you know. He stepped closer, and in the lantern light, she could see genuine concern etched across his weathered features. Is everything all right? Is Robert okay? He's sleeping, Eleanor said. Finally, the exhaustion just hit him all at once. And how's your head? He gestured to the bandage on her forehead. It's fine, just a small cut. Eleanor took a breath, pushing forward with why she'd come. George, I need to ask a favor. For the funeral, we'll need to transport chairs from the church, and our truck isn't big enough. Could we borrow your flatbed trailer? Of course, George said immediately, his voice full of sympathy. Of course, you can have it for as long as you need. He moved toward the corner of the barn where equipment was stored. Let me show you where I keep everything: the hitch, the tie-down straps, the safety chains. Eleanor followed him, grateful for his easy agreement. George pulled back a tarp covering the trailer hitch and began explaining the setup. She hold about 40 chairs if you stack them right, he was saying, demonstrating how the ball hitch worked. The wiring harness for the lights is right here. Sometimes it's finicky, so you might need to jiggle it. And these straps here, they're rated for. Eleanor's attention drifted as George talked. Her eyes wandered around the familiar barn, taking in the organized chaos of a working farm. That's when she noticed his denim jacket thrown carelessly over a hay bale near the workbench. The jacket's pockets were turned partially out, personal items spilling onto the hay. His wallet, a ring of keys, some crumpled receipts, and a folded piece of paper, partially open. Even from several feet away, Eleanor could see it was a child's drawing. The bright crayon colors stood out against the white paper. Without thinking, she stepped closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. The drawing showed 2 stick figures. A small boy with long brown hair, labeled Danny in careful, urgy childish letters, standing next to a tall man labeled Daddy. The boy wore a green shirt with stars, and he was holding the man's hand. There were hearts drawn around them and a sun. With a smiley face in the corner, Eleanor's blood turned to ice. The boy in the drawing looked exactly like Daniel would at 11 years old. The same long brown hair, the same way of drawing faces that Daniel had developed in his art classes. Even the handwriting, double quotes, ... The safety rating on these straps is important. George was still talking behind her, oblivious. You don't want chairs flying off on the highway. Eleanor forced herself to look away from the drawing, her heart hammering so hard she was sure George must hear it. She managed to turn back to him, her face carefully neutral despite the terror coursing through her veins. Thank you, she said. Surprised her voice sounded normal. This is really helpful. I should... I should get back before Robert wakes up and worries. She started toward the door, every instinct screaming at her to run. But as she moved, George's expression changed. His friendly neighbor mask slipped, replaced by something cold and calculating. Eleanor, he said quietly. She was 3 steps from the door when George moved, faster than she would have thought possible for a man his age. He stepped between her and the exit, and suddenly there was a shotgun in his hands. She hadn't seen where it came from, but now its barrel was pointed at her chest. You saw Danny's drawing, George said, his voice eerily calm. I saw you looking at it. George, I don't ... Don't lie to me, Eleanor. His tone was almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. You know now, I can see it in your eyes. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to process the impossible. Daniel... You have Daniel. George's face twisted with something that might have been regret. I tried so hard to spare you from more pain. 3 years, Eleanor. 3 years I've kept this secret, watching you and Robert suffer, wanting to tell you, but knowing it would only hurt you more. And now you just had to come here tonight. Where is he? Eleanor's voice cracked. Where's my son? Walk, George, commanded, gesturing with the shotgun toward the back of the barn. Deeper inside. Move. Eleanor had no choice. She walked slowly, her legs shaking as George followed with the gun trained on her back. He calls me Daddy now, George said, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. Took a while, but children adapt. They forget. He's happy, Eleanor. I want you to know that. He's been happy. And Leo? Eleanor could barely get the words out. George's expression darkened. He got sick 2 years ago. Pneumonia, I think. I tried everything. Antibiotics from the vet supply, fever reducers, even some old remedies my grandmother used, but he kept getting worse. Eleanor felt her knees buckle, but George prodded her. With the gun barrel to keep moving, I couldn't take him to a doctor, he continued. His voice made, You understand that, right? They would have taken Danny away, too. So I did what I could, but he was so small, so fragile. When he died, I preserved him as best I could, until I could figure out what to do. The full horror of it crashed over. Eleanor George had taken both her sons. He'd kept them hidden for 3 years, while she and Robert died inside every day, not knowing. Leo had suffered and died without his mother. And Daniel ... He's alive, Eleanor whispered. Daniel's alive. Danny, George corrected sharply. His name is Danny now. My son, Danny. Eleanor realized with growing horror that he'd had Daniel all this time, just across the fence line. Close enough that she could have heard her son's voice on a quiet night. If she'd only known to listen. George prodded Eleanor with the shotgun barrel toward what looked like a solid wall at the back of the barn. But as they approached, she saw it. A cleverly concealed door built into the wooden paneling. George reached past her to unlatch it, revealing wooden stairs descending into darkness. Down, he commanded. Eleanor hesitated at the top of the stairs. She'd never known existed in all her years of visiting this barn. George had hidden this so well, constructed it so carefully. The implications made her stomach lurch. Move, George said, his voice harder now. She descended the wooden steps, her hand gripping the rough rail. The temperature dropped as they went deeper, and she realized they were going beneath the old feed storage area. The smell hit her then. Manure, thick and overwhelming. Of course, the massive manure pile above would mask any scent from search. Dogs. The police had been here multiple times in those first months, their dogs sniffing every inch of George's property, and found nothing. At the bottom of the stairs, another door. George reached around her to open it, and Eleanor gasped. The room beyond was nothing like the rough basement she'd expected. The walls were painted a soft blue, decorated with star decals. A bookshelf stood against one wall, packed with children's books, chapter books for older kids, not the picture books her sons had loved 3 years ago. A comfortable bed with a handmade quilt occupied one corner. There was even a small refrigerator, a microwave, a bathroom area behind a curtain, and at a child-sized desk, a boy sat drawing. Eleanor's legs nearly gave out. Daniel. The boy's head snapped up, and Eleanor saw her son taller now, his baby face gone, replaced by the angular features of approaching adolescence. 11 years old. She'd missed 3 years of her son's life. But it was Daniel's eyes that broke Eleanor's heart. Hollow, fearful, confused. At the sight of Eleanor, Daniel flinched and scrambled backward, pressing himself into the corner behind the desk. Eleanor's scream of anguish tore from her throat before she could stop it. Daniel, baby, it's Mommy. Calm down, George snapped, nervousness creeping into his voice. He kept the shotgun trained on Eleanor as she instinctively moved toward her son. Stay where you are. You're scaring him. Who is she? Daniel whispered, his voice directed at George, not Eleanor. "Daddy, who is she?" The word daddy was a knife in Eleanor's heart. Her son was looking at George with trust, with dependence, while staring at his own mother like a stranger. "I've kept him safe," George said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "Look at this room. Look how well I've cared for him. He's been educated. I've homeschooled him myself. He can read at a high school level. He knows math, science, history. He's been my son Danny these 3 years, and he's been happy." "Daniel," Eleanor sobbed, ignoring George's gun to take another step toward her son. "Daniel, sweetie, it's me. It's Mummy. Please, baby, look at me." Daniel pressed further into the corner, his eyes wide with fear. "My name is Danny," he said in a small voice. "I don't know you." George stepped partially between them, the gun never wavering. "This is the woman from the accident, Danny. Remember I told you about the accident? This is the woman who hurt your brother, Leo." "No," Eleanor cried out in horror. "No, Daniel, that's not true. He's lying to you. You're scaring him," George said coldly. "Danny, remember what I taught you about strangers, about people who might try to confuse you." Eleanor watched her son nod, saw the trust in Daniel's eyes as he looked at George, and felt her world shatter all over again. 3 years, 3 years of lies, of twisted stories, of a stolen life. "Daniel, please," Eleanor begged, tears streaming down her face. "Remember our farm. Remember collecting eggs together every morning. You loved the speckled hen. You named her Patches. Remember how we'd make pancakes on Saturdays. How Daddy would make them into funny shapes." Something flickered in Daniel's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe a fragment of memory. But then he shook his head violently. "My parents died in a car accident. Daddy George saved me. He pulled me from the wreck. He's been happy here," George insisted, but Eleanor could hear the agitation growing in his voice. He paced between her and the stairs, clearly struggling with the situation spiraling out of his control. "He has everything he needs. Books, games, education. I take him upstairs to the house at night. He has a beautiful room there too. We watch movies together. I teach him cooking. We do art projects. Look at his drawings." Eleanor's eyes swept over the drawings taped to the walls. Hundreds of them. Pictures of a farmhouse, George's farmhouse. Pictures of animals. And over, pictures of a tall man labeled Daddy, protecting a small boy from shadowy figures in the background. "Please," Eleanor whispered, not sure if she was pleading with George or with God. "Please, he's my son." George's pacing grew more frantic. The gun shook slightly in his hands. Eleanor could only pray that Robert would wake up, would realize she'd been gone too long, would come looking. But even if he did, would he know to look here, in this hidden room that had concealed her son for 3 years? "Daddy," Daniel's voice was small, uncertain. "What's happening? Why is she crying?" George's face twisted. The careful fantasy he'd built was crumbling, and Eleanor could see he knew it. The sound of footsteps above them made Eleanor's heart leap. Heavy boots on the barn floor, and then, "George, you in here?" "Have you seen Eleanor?" Robert's voice. He'd woken up, realized she was gone. "Come looking." Eleanor opened her mouth to scream a warning, but George moved with shocking speed. The shotgun. Barrel pressed hard against her ribs, and his breath was hot against her ear. "Not a sound," he whispered. "You make any noise, try to warn him when he comes down, and I'll have to shoot you both." "The boy doesn't need to see that." Eleanor's eyes darted to Daniel, still huddled in the corner, watching with wide, frightened eyes. George was right. Whatever happened, she couldn't let her son witness more violence. "Stay put," George commanded. "Both of you, don't move." He backed toward the stairs, keeping the gun trained on Eleanor until the last moment. Then he was climbing up, pulling the hidden door closed above him. Eleanor heard the latch click into place. "George," Robert's voice came again, muffled now through the floor. "Your truck's here." Eleanor said she was coming to ask about the trailer. "Coming," George called out, his voice impossibly casual. Eleanor heard his footsteps moving across the barn floor above. "Yeah, she was here earlier. Asked about the trailer for the funeral. I showed her where everything was. Then she headed back. Must have just missed her." "She's not at home," Robert said, and Eleanor could hear the worry in his voice. "It's been over half an hour. Probably took the long way back," George suggested. "You know how it is. Sometimes you need to walk to clear your head. Hell of a day you folks have had." Eleanor looked at her son, at Daniel, who was watching her with terrified confusion. This might be their only chance. If George convinced Robert to leave, if he came back down here with that gun. She thought of Leo, of how her baby had died sick and afraid in this man's captivity. She thought of 3 years of not knowing, of the police treating them like suspects while their son was right here, just across the fence line. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Eleanor raced for the stairs. Her hands hit the door hard, fumbling for the latch. Found it, burst through. "Robert, he has Daniel," she screamed. "He has our baby." The scene in the barn erupted into chaos. George spun around from where he'd been leading Robert toward the door, his face contorted with rage and desperation. The shotgun. He'd propped it against the barn wall while talking to Robert, trying to appear normal. George lunged for the weapon. Eleanor threw herself forward, knowing she had to reach it first, or they were all dead. Her hands closed on the barrel just as George grabbed the stock. They struggled violently, the gun between them. George was stronger, years of farm work giving him an advantage. The barrel swung wildly as Eleanor fought to keep him from gaining control. "Robert," Eleanor gasped out between struggles. Downstairs, hidden room. Understanding crashed over Robert's face. He didn't hesitate, didn't question. He launched himself at George from the side, all 3 of them now tangled in a desperate fight for the weapon. The gun swung between them, George's finger dangerously close to the trigger. Eleanor felt her grip slipping, George's superior strength slowly overwhelming her. Robert had his hands on the stock now, too. 4 hands fighting for control of one weapon. A moment of clarity hit Eleanor. She couldn't win this fight, but she could make sure someone survived to save Daniel. She let go. The sudden release sent George stumbling backward, with Robert still grappling him. Eleanor didn't wait to see what happened. She ran out of the barn, into the night, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her. Behind her, she could hear the men crashing into equipment, grunting with effort, the clatter of tools being knocked over in their struggle. The house. She had to reach the house, call for help. Her lungs burned as she sprinted along the fence line. Behind her, a cry of pain. She couldn't tell whose dot the house lights beckoned ahead. She crashed through the back door, lungs heaving, hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. 911. What's your emergency? This is Eleanor Vance, 1234 County Road 5. She screamed into the phone. George Henderson has my son. He's had him for 3 years. My husband's fighting him. He has a gun. Please, send help. Ma'am, slow down. You said someone has your son. He kidnapped him 3 years ago. He's in a hidden room under his barn. Please, they're fighting. He has a shotgun. Officers are on the way, ma'am. Stay on the line. Eleanor dropped the phone. Robert's backup pistol. He kept it in the kitchen drawer. Her hands closed around the familiar grip. She'd only fired it once, years ago, when Robert insisted on teaching her, but it was loaded and ready. She ran back out into the night, the weapon heavy in her hands. Already, She could hear sirens in the distance. Rural Kansas or not, a kidnapping in progress brought everyone by the time she reached George's barn. Red and blue lights were painting the sky. Police cars skidded into the yard, officers jumping out with weapons drawn. An ambulance followed, then more cars, state police, sheriff's department, even unmarked vehicles. Eleanor burst into the barn to find Robert standing over George, who was writhing on the ground, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched his leg. The shotgun lay several feet away. In the struggle, it had discharged. Eleanor ran to him, checking frantically for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," he panted. "Gun went off when we were fighting. Hit him in the leg." "Eleanor, did you say, is Daniel really down here?" Eleanor called to the SWAT officers, now swarming the property. "There's a hidden door. My son's down there." She didn't wait for them to secure the scene. While EMTs rushed to treat George, keeping him restrained even as they worked, Eleanor ran back to the hidden door. She yanked it open and flew down the stairs. Daniel was exactly where she'd left him, pressed into the corner, tears streaming down his face. "Daddy George," he was crying. "I want Daddy George." Eleanor's heart shattered all over again, but she pushed through the pain. She gathered her son into her arms, holding him tight, even as Daniel struggled. "It's okay, baby," Eleanor whispered. "It's okay. You're safe now. I've got you." Police photographers were already descending the stairs, documenting everything. The drawings covering the walls, hundreds of them. The homeschool workbooks stacked neatly on the shelf. The calendar where George had marked off 3 years of stolen days with little stars and smiley faces. Evidence of a life lived in captivity, of a childhood stolen and remade. Eleanor carried Daniel up the stairs, her son's arms finally, tentatively wrapping around her neck. They emerged into a chaos of flashing lights. 20 emergency vehicles at least, more arriving every moment. The biggest crime scene Redwood County had ever seen. Robert rushed to them immediately, tears streaming down his face as he wrapped both of them in his arms. "Daniel," he whispered, his voice breaking, "my baby boy." But Daniel stiffened in their embrace, turning his face away from Robert to look back toward the barn where EMTs were loading George onto a stretcher. "Daddy?" he called out, his voice small and confused. "What's happening to Daddy?" A female officer approached them gently, a shock blanket in her hands. "We need to get him to the hospital," she said softly. "Both of you should come, too. The detectives will need statements, but that can wait. Your son needs medical attention first." As they moved toward the waiting ambulance, Eleanor caught sight of Sheriff Miller, his face a mixture of relief and horror. He'd been their friend for so many years, had helped search for the boys, never imagining they were right across the property line the entire time. The weight of that failure was written in every line of his weathered face. The fluorescent lights of Redwood County Hospital's surgical wing cast harsh shadows as Detective Hayes sat beside George Henderson's gurney. George was under police guard. 2 officers stationed outside the recovery room. His right leg was heavily bandaged where the shotgun pellet had torn through muscle and shattered bone. The anesthesia was wearing off, and Hayes had been waiting for this moment. That twilight state where inhibitions were lowered, but the mind was clear enough to speak. George's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they landed on Hayes's badge. "Mr. Henderson," Hayes said quietly, his digital recorder already running. "I'm Detective Hayes. You're in the hospital. You've had surgery on your leg. Do you understand?" George nodded slowly, his mouth dry. A nurse provided water through a straw, then stepped back out of the room at Hayes's gesture. "I need to advise you of your rights," Hayes began. But George interrupted. "I'll tell you everything," he said, his voice raw but clear. They deserve to know what happened to their boys. Hayes kept his expression neutral, despite the chill that ran down his spine. Start from the beginning. George's eyes grew distant, looking past Hayes to something only he could see. I watched them grow up, from across the property line. Eleanor would bring them as babies to work in her garden, set up that little playpen under the oak tree. They took their first steps in that yard. I watched it all. His voice took on a wistful quality. After my son died, after my wife left, me, ... Those boys became. They were like sunlight, the only bright thing I could see from my property. They'd wave to me when they saw me in my fields, called me Uncle George. The kidnapping, Hayes prompted gently. Tell me about that day. 3 years ago. George's hands moved restlessly on the hospital blanket. It wasn't spontaneous. I'd been planning for months. Built that room under the barn first. Took me nearly a year, working only at night. Had to be careful about the ventilation, the soundproofing. Couldn't have anyone hearing. Hayes fought to keep his revulsion from showing. The premeditation was chilling. I knew their routine, George continued. Knew Eleanor and Robert couldn't see the egg stand from their house. I'd checked the sightlines carefully. The boys trusted me completely. Why wouldn't they? I'd been Uncle George their whole lives. What happened that day? I drove up to their stand, just like any other customer. Told them I needed 2 dozen eggs for a church bake sale, but had forgotten my wallet. Asked if they'd mind riding with me to my farm to get paid. George's voice cracked slightly. They climbed right into my truck. Leo was chattering about school starting soon. Daniel had his favorite toy. And then, I took them to the barn first. Told them I wanted to show them the new kittens. They loved animals, especially Daniel. Once they were down in the room, he paused, swallowing hard. I told them there had been an accident, that their parents were hurt, and I was going to take care of them until everything was okay. Hayes made notes, his stomach turning. What about Leo? Tell me what happened to him. George's composure finally cracked, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. He got sick 2 years ago, spring of last year. Started as just a cough, but it got worse. High fever, trouble breathing. I think it was pneumonia. Why didn't you take him to a doctor? How could I? George's voice rose slightly. They would have taken Danny away. I tried everything. Antibiotics from the vet supply, fever reducers, even some old remedies my grandmother used. Danny begged me to get help for his brother, but I couldn't risk it. Hayes had to pause the recording briefly, as George broke down completely. When he composed himself, the story continued, each detail more horrific than the last. He deteriorated over 3 weeks. I stayed with him constantly, trying to keep him comfortable. Danny wouldn't leave his side. When he finally... George couldn't say the word. I wrapped him in blankets and put him in the large freezer in my processing shed. I didn't know what else to do. The milk can, Hayes prompted, though the detective beside him had to step out of the room. I remembered seeing them during the Vance's barn sale years back. Snuck over one night and took one. Then George's voice dropped to a whisper. I had to make him fit. Used the tools from my processing shed. Waited for the spring flooding to put it in the creek. Thought the water would take it far away, or if someone found it, they'd suspect the parents. The can came from their farm, after all. Hayes forced himself to continue. Tell me about Daniel. How did you manage to hide him during all the searches? George seemed to strengthen slightly, a disturbing pride entering his voice. I'd move him between the barn room and the house. Had a beautiful room set up in the attic. It used to be my son's room. Painted it blue. Bought every toy and book a boy could want. During the searches, I'd keep him in whichever location they weren't checking. The dogs never found the barn room. because of the manure pile above it. And you told him what about his family? That they died in a car accident, along with his brother. That I'd pulled him from the wreck, saved him. He was young enough that after a few months, he started to believe it. Called me Daddy. Said his name was Danny. In the pediatric ward 2 floors up, Eleanor sat in an uncomfortable chair beside Daniel's bed, holding her son's hand, even though Daniel kept trying to pull away. Child psychologist Dr. Evans was gently working with the boy, who clutched a worn teddy bear, one of many toys George had provided. Danny, can you tell me about your drawings? Dr. Evans asked, holding up one of hundreds they'd recovered from George's property. My name is Danny, Daniel insisted, his voice small but firm. Daddy says you're trying to confuse me. He warned me about bad people who might try to take me away. Eleanor bit her lip to keep from sobbing. Her son was right there, alive, breathing, but might as well have been a stranger. The drawings spread across the hospital table showed a happy life, a boy and his daddy reading together, cooking, playing games, and always in the background, shadowy figures labeled bad people that Daddy was protecting him from. What happened to your brother? Dr. Evans asked gently. Daniel's face crumpled. He got sick. Daddy tried to save him, but he died. It wasn't his fault. He did everything he could. Down in the surgical ward, George was still talking, the words pouring out like a confession in a cathedral. I homeschooled him using an online curriculum. He's brilliant, reads at a high school level now. I taught him mathematics, science, history. We'd have art time every afternoon. He loves to draw, and he never questioned the story about his parents. He did at first, but children's memories fade. I'd show him news articles about car accidents, tell him that's what happened to his family. After a year, he stopped asking. After 2, he called me Daddy without prompting. By year 3, he was Danny completely. The lead detective entered the room, having composed himself. Mr. Henderson, our psychiatrists have completed their initial evaluation. You've been diagnosed with severe delusional disorder stemming from your son's death. Do you understand what that means? George's eyes flashed. I'm not crazy. I loved those boys. I was a good father to them. You kidnapped them. Leo died in your care. Daniel doesn't even know who he really is anymore. Danny, George corrected sharply. His name is Danny, and he's happy. He's been happy. Back in the pediatric ward, Dr. Evans was explaining the long road ahead to Eleanor and Robert, who'd arrived. After giving his own statement to police, he's been living in an alternate reality for 3 years, Dr. Evans said gently. In his mind, George is his father. You're strangers who are trying to take him away from the only life he remembers. It will take months, maybe years, for him to process the truth and readjust. But he will, Eleanor asked desperately. He'll remember us eventually. Memory recovery in children is complex. Some memories may return, others are likely lost forever. The trauma of having his perceived reality shattered. It's going to be a difficult journey. He'll need intensive therapy, patience, and time. Eleanor looked at her son, who was drawing again, always drawing, as if he could make sense of the world through crayons and paper. We'll wait as long as it takes. He's alive. That's all that matters. But even as she said it, her heart broke. For Leo, who died sick and afraid, calling for a mother who couldn't come. The child who'd been disposed of like garbage, by a man who claimed to love him, as George was prepared for transport to the county jail. He was wheeled past the hospital lobby where Eleanor and Robert were filling out paperwork. He saw them through the glass doors and called out, his voice carrying despite the guard's attempts to quiet him. I loved them both, he shouted. I was a good father to them. Tell Danny I love him. Tell him Daddy loves him. Eleanor turned away, unable to look at the man who'd stolen 3 years of their lives, who'd killed one son and brainwashed the other. Robert's arm came around her shoulders as the elevator doors closed on George's desperate face, still lost, in the delusion that he'd been saving the boys rather than destroying them. Clara was in her 70s now, sharp-witted and practical. She stirred her coffee slowly before answering. Evan, God, he was something. Always had charts in his hand, always following up. Sweet to patients, not so sweet to doctors who cut corners. Adam leaned in slightly. Did he seem unstable, burned out? Clara raised a grey eyebrow. No. He was just intense, like he was carrying more than he let on. Did he talk about anyone giving him trouble? Clara took a sip of her drink, then nodded. Finch, he didn't trust him. Said his patients weren't getting the care they were promised. Said he didn't like the way things were being handled in internal. The second nurse, Helen Bishop, lived in a retirement community north of Port Sterling. Her memory was cloudier, but she recalled one thing clearly: a hushed conversation in the break room where Evan had told someone, "If they think I'm letting this go, they're wrong." Helen didn't know who they were, but she remembered Evan's voice, low, firm, and scared. Back at the precinct, Adam put in a request for any security footage that might have survived from 2005. The odds were slim. Records that old were usually lost to degradation or recycling. But Northwood had archived some old reels as part of a now-defunct liability policy. A single DVD, labeled UA, West Corridor, June 29, 2005, arrived from archives. When played, it showed a flickering black-and-white view of a hallway just outside the ER nurse's station. Evan entered at 6:03 p.m., adjusting his stethoscope and greeting someone off-screen. That was the last they saw of him. The recording ran for 6 more hours. He never exited. No footage from the morgue level was retained, according to internal memos. Those cameras had been disconnected weeks earlier for renovation wiring repairs that were never logged as completed. Adam pulled the nurse's log again. Evan had signed in at 6 p.m. There was no sign-out. His name simply disappeared, and so did his notes. None of his patient charts from that evening remained in the hospital's official records. It was as though his last shift had been scrubbed. Adam's next stop was the financial history of Northwood. From 2003 to 2009, the hospital reported inconsistent revenue and steadily declining inpatient numbers. Their internal memos referenced deferred maintenance, furloughs, and auxiliary research partnerships. A series of grants from pharmaceutical companies had floated the internal medicine department during those years, particularly under the direction of Dr. Alistair Finch. Adam found records of fund transfers, marked for pilot study development and pharmacological data collection. No patient names, no study protocols, just vague references and accounting shells. Finch's name appeared on most of the documents. Adam made a separate note. He'd been mentioned twice now, once by the nurse, once in funding logs. He'd been chief of internal medicine the year Evan disappeared, the year those strange payments began. And now he was retired, quietly living out his days in a gated community on the far end of Sterling Ridge. That night, Adam sat in his apartment, surrounded by a small forest of open folders. On his laptop, Evan's licensing photo remained pulled up beside his hospital ID scan. He kept returning to the way Evan's name had vanished from the logs, the way his apartment had been cleaned out, the absence of a missing persons report. Every inch of it felt intentional, like threads had been snipped one by one, not frayed naturally. Adam began the morning with a lead he hoped would add depth to Evan's backstory. Family, next of kin, someone who could speak to who he was outside the hospital corridors. He requested Evan's licensing application from the state medical board. It listed no emergency contact. A check through the Department of Health records revealed that both of his parents had died in a car accident in 1998, 7 years before his disappearance. Evan was 21 then, a second-year med student. There were no siblings on file, no surviving relatives listed on his tax returns. The apartment lease hadn't included a cosigner. He had left behind no one, at least not officially. Adam stared at the blank line where next of kin should have been. Even in death, he was his own island. The realization weighed heavier than expected, not just because it complicated things, but because it meant no one had even been looking for him. By midday, Adam was back at the City Archives facility, in the long basement room filled with rolling metal shelves and yellowed folders stacked inside sagging boxes. He had requested Northwood's shift records for June and July of 2005. The clerk, a tall man in his 60s named George, pushed the cart in front of him with an apologetic shrug. "You're not going to like this," he said, setting a water-damaged carton on the table. "We lost a chunk of these back in 10. Mold outbreak, HVAC flooded. This room took out 3 entire cabinets." Adam flipped open the box. As promised, the folders were warped and brittle. Several were stuck together, their contents illegible. The 2 weeks following Evan's disappearance were missing entirely. "Nothing digital," George said. "It was all analog back then. Admin didn't start scanning until 2012. Adam held up one folder that had somehow escaped damage. The roster for July 5th to 12th was mostly intact, but Evan's name was absent. Whoever was in charge of scheduling had simply moved on. It was as if he had never been there to begin with. As he packed to leave, George hesitated. "You're the one looking into that doctor, right? The one from the drawer?" Adam nodded. "Evan Reed." He scratched his head. "Hang on a sec." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a thinner folder marked Unsorted Department. Audit backups. These were my backups. I used to keep copies. Was paranoid about the originals getting ruined. Adam opened the file. Inside were several stapled sheets from the ER rotation schedules. The paper was cleaner than the others, slightly off-white. Handwritten, not typed. June 29th, 2005. Read, E. Night, Room 3. June 29th, 2005. Attending, Finch. A initialed, AF. There it was. A direct connection. To patients under Reed's care that night were assigned to Dr. Alistair Finch. His initials appeared beside both cases. One of the patients had been admitted under a special intake code, FTR82. "What's that code?" he asked. George, he frowned. "That's not standard triage. Might have been part of a pilot or research intake." Adam copied the page and folded it into his binder. He didn't say anything more, but he was already planning his next visit. Dr. Alistair Finch lived alone in a high-rise condominium near Centennial Park. His assistant answered the door and escorted Adam to the study. The room smelled faintly of polish and leather. Books lined every wall, most medical, a few philosophical. Finch himself stood near the window, a tall, well-kept man in his 70s, with silvery hair and a confident stillness. "Detective Rossi," he said warmly. "Please." "Sit," Adam declined. "I'm investigating a death." A body was recovered at the old Northwood site. He nodded, not surprised. "I heard something on the radio." "You think I'm connected? You were chief of internal medicine in 2005. "I was," he said evenly. "But that was a long time ago. Do you remember Dr. Evan Reed?" He smiled faintly, but there was something mechanical in the movement. "The name rings a bell. Resident, wasn't he? Attending, actually. He disappeared during a night shift on June 29th, 2005. His remains were found sealed in a drawer in the hospital morgue. His face didn't change." "I see," he said. "How tragic. You were assigned to 2 of his patients that night. Your initials appear on the intake sheets. That's not unusual. I oversaw many residents. He waved one hand lightly. But I don't recall any specific incident. Adam narrowed his eyes. Nothing at all. No, he said, still composed. But I'll help however I can. His gut told him he already knew what he was going to ask, long before he walked in. After the interview, Adam returned to his office and started digging deeper into Finch's career. His name appeared in 5 medical journals between 2006 and 2019. After Northwood closed, he took a temporary fellowship in Chicago, then joined a private healthcare board, and later chaired a non-profit focused on innovation in institutional ethics. His career, far from being stalled by Northwood's decline, had surged forward. He searched public financial disclosures. Finch had served on the boards of 3 pharmaceutical companies during the early 10s. Each one had ties to experimental treatments and accelerated clinical trials. His notes began to fan outward like a web. Northwood's internal funding, missing. Shift logs, mysterious intake codes. And now a doctor who had quietly risen in prominence despite being linked to a vanished colleague. He felt himself tightening around a truth he couldn't name yet, but it was close. In the finance archives of Northwood, Adam found a curious payout. On June 26, 2005, 3 days before Evan's last shifter bonus of $7,000 had been issued to Arthur Vance, morgue supervisor. It had been logged under hazard duty allocation, hazard pay, but no incident report accompanied it. No lab spill. No equipment malfunction. No explanation. He looked up his name. He had left the hospital abruptly in 2006. No forwarding address. No employment history since. But that wasn't his only lead. He arranged to speak with another former nurse, Laura Chen, now working as an administrator in a small hospice center outside Port Sterling. They met in a quiet break room. Laura was in her early 60s, her posture guarded. "I remember Evan," she said after a long pause. "We weren't close, but people noticed him." "In what way?" Laura hesitated, then looked away. "He was always following up on cases, writing things down, asking questions." Adam waited. He wasn't wrong to do it, but people didn't like it. You're not supposed to push too hard in a place like that, especially when you're new. Adam's voice was quiet. "Did he ever say he felt unsafe?" "He never said it," Laura replied, "but you could see it." He started carrying his bag with him, even to the lounge. He didn't leave notes on shared clipboards. Everything went straight into his pocket. "Why do you think he disappeared?" Laura swallowed. Evan cared too much. That was his mistake. Adam sat in his car outside the hospice center for a full 5 minutes before going in. He wasn't sure how Laura Chen would react to another visit, especially with what he now carried in his folder. He didn't want to use it, but he knew from years of homicide work that guilt could be a more powerful force than any threat. Laura greeted him at the side entrance with the same guarded stiffness. Her short salt and pepper hair was pulled back tightly, and she wore a visitor's badge clipped to her collar. "I already told you everything I know," she said softly, glancing at the folder in Adam's hand. Adam followed her into the break room. Again, same place, same dim overhead light. He set the folder on the table, but didn't open it right away. "I don't think you did," Adam said calmly. "Not all of it." Laura looked away, arms crossed. Adam gently opened the folder and slid a single photo across the table. Evan's skeletal remains, partially wrapped in decayed linens, taken during recovery from the morgue drawer. No gore, just the unmistakable outline of a man folded where he didn't belong. Laura's face changed instantly. Her hand went to her mouth, her breath catching. "He was your friend," Adam said. "You knew something happened, and you've carried it this long." Laura's eyes welled, and she blinked hard. "You can't put that in front of me," and expect me to... She stopped herself, shaking her head. I lied, that first time. I didn't want to be involved. Again. That was the word Adam had been waiting for. They sat in silence for a long moment. Laura finally spoke, voice shaking. That night, June 29th, I was on the late rotation. I had just finished rounds when I saw Evan go down the hallway toward Dr. Finch's office. It was nearly midnight. Adam didn't interrupt. I knew he'd been pushing hard, asking questions about patient charts. Some of the cases coming in weren't adding up, vital signs missing, medications recorded that weren't administered. He thought someone was falsifying data. I told him to be careful. Did he go into his office? He did. He didn't come out. Laura swallowed. I went down there maybe 20 minutes later. I didn't see him, but I heard them through the wall. He was yelling at him. I couldn't hear the words, just the tone, angry, accusatory. And then it got quiet. What did you do? I left, Laura whispered. I didn't want to be part of it. You don't understand. Finch had power. He could bury people. He was going after something too big. Adam studied her face. You didn't see him again after that? No, Laura said, shaking her head. Next day, he wasn't on shift. Week after, the hospital said he was on leave, and you didn't speak up. I was afraid, Laura said quietly. We all were. Adam sat back, giving her space. Was that the last time you interacted with him? Laura hesitated again, then opened her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and faded. It was a blank envelope, yellowing with age. No markings, no name. He gave me this the week before, Laura said. Told me to keep it safe. Said if something happened to him, someone had to come forward. Adam leaned forward. Where is it? I burned it. I got scared after he disappeared. I told myself I was protecting myself, but I knew what I was really doing, Laura said, her voice cracking. Adam was quiet. Adam went back to his desk and pulled Arthur Vance's file. The morgue supervisor had vanished in 2009, 2 weeks before. Northwood was formally shut down. He'd taken early retirement, no forwarding address. The hospital listed him as administratively off-boarded, but Adam found no pension records, no insurance filings, no tax forms under his name after that. He ran a national search for aliases and came up with a match. Evan Marsh, Cedar Creek, Washington. A man of the same age, same height, same partial social security number. He owned a small one-bedroom house registered under a land trust and paid property tax in cash. Adam drove out 2 days later, staying in an unmarked city rental. He confirmed, visually, same man, aged and thinner, but unmistakable. He had grown a full beard and dyed his hair, but his gait matched the video from 2006 hospital security footage. Over the next 3 days, Adam set up a quiet surveillance schedule. Vance kept to himself. Every other morning he left early, walked to a nearby credit union, and made small cash withdrawals, no more than a few hundred at a time. He bought groceries in cash, drove an unregistered 2016 pickup truck. The most curious detail came on the 3rd day. He drove to a remote storage facility outside the city, entered using a key card registered under the name Russell Grant, and stayed inside Unit 103 for nearly 40 minutes. When he emerged, he was empty-handed. Adam pulled the logbook later. He'd been visiting the same unit twice a month for nearly a decade. He pulled records for Unit 103's registration, leased under a fabricated business name linked to a defunct healthcare courier company. The address used: an abandoned warehouse once owned by a subsidiary of Northwood's former parent group. It was enough to move. Adam waited outside his house the next morning. When he stepped outside with his coat and keys, he approached. Arthur Vance, he said calmly. He froze. "You're not in trouble yet, but I need you to come with me." He didn't cuff him, just opened the car door and waited. He got in without a word. At the precinct, he brought him to a small interview room. His tone stayed level. "We found payment records. A lump sum issued to you 3 days before Dr. Evan Reed's final shift. $7,000. Unusual for a morgue tech." He said nothing. "We also know you were in the building when he disappeared, that you were responsible for sealing the cadaver drawers before the shutdown." Still nothing. His fingers fidgeted against the table edge. Adam leaned in. "There's a drawer in Northwood that was marked Hazard, cleared. The same drawer we found him in. You signed off on it." His lips parted, just slightly. He kept his voice calm. "I'm not here to scare you, Mr. Vance. I want the truth. Because whatever you're still running from after all these years, it's not going to stay hidden." His hand trembled slightly. He looked up at him. He saw it, not guilt, but fear. It was just after sunrise when Adam pulled into the gravel lot behind Meadowbrook Storage in Cedar Creek. A deputy U.S. Marshal accompanied him, standing quietly while he reviewed the signed warrant. It hadn't taken long. Between Vance's alias, the phony lease, and the connection to a defunct hospital subsidiary, the paper trail had been enough to justify a search. The unit in question, 103, looked like every other rusted door on the row. But as the lock clattered, open and the door groaned upward, Adam felt his pulse thicken. Inside, rows of battered banker's boxes were stacked on plastic shelves. A fan unit stood in one corner, long unplugged. Dust coated everything, but there was no sign of water damage or tampering. Most of the labels were handwritten. Farm docs, 2004, Northwood staff files, ledgers, X-ray transcripts. He approached slowly. The temperature inside was cool but stale. He opened the first box. Patient records, full names, diagnoses, medication sheets, most handwritten. These weren't copies. These were originals. Not one of them bore a digital ID tag. Adam picked up another folder labeled 2003 to 2005 critical mortality cases. Dozens of names, some marked with black ink check marks, others red X's. At the very bottom was an unmarked envelope. He pulled it out with gloved fingers. The handwriting inside made him stop cold. The folder inside the envelope was thin, almost brittle with age. On the front, incident reports, unfiled. Each page was a case. Summary, neatly typed on yellowing paper, unsigned but stamped with hospital notations. Some had red slips attached. Patient declined participation. No Form 3C on file. The patients listed had all died within 48 hours of declining treatment participation. Adam paged through slowly, his eyes catching on familiar names. The sixth entry hit like a blow to the chest. Patient Edward Rossi. Date of admission, the 2nd of August 2004. Primary physician, A. Finch. Outcome, cardiac arrest, following observation, hold. Consent to trial, declined his father. Adam stood still for a long moment, reading the lines over again. He remembered his father's sudden passing. He had always been told it was a random, tragic heart failure during a routine observation stay. He was told there had been no complications, no warning. Now here he was, listed in a secret incident report alongside half a dozen others who had refused trial participation and died shortly thereafter. Adam closed the folder slowly. His breath was shallow but steady. This was personal. In a separate box, buried beneath a stack of personnel timesheets, Adam found a soft green notebook with a cracked spine. On the inside cover, in neat handwriting, he flipped through page after page of Evan Reed's notes. Each entry written in concise script. June 12th, patient refused. Study med. later transferred under different IDAF initials, appear on daily entries. Records edited, no signatures from patient, no consent forms, none on file. HR not responding. Adam stared at the notebook, the pieces finally fitting together with eerie clarity. Evan hadn't just stumbled across medical errors. He had documented a pattern, a system, a quiet mechanism for eliminating liability. Patients who didn't consent. 2 experimental protocols died soon after, and their objections vanished from the records. He was about to expose it and was silenced. His blood boiled, but he knew he needed more evidence to take down those responsible. Back at the Cedar Creek precinct, Arthur Vance sat quietly in the interview room. His fingers trembled slightly against the tabletop, his eyes flicking toward the mirror as if he could sense the weight pressing in from behind it. Adam entered with a box in his hands. No introductions. He sat, removed Evan's notebook, and laid it down. "I went through the storage unit," he said. Vance didn't respond. "You saved everything," he said calmly. "I think part of you always expected this moment." Still nothing. He opened the incident folder next. "There's no mistake anymore. I have the reports, the ledgers, the documents you were told to store, the ones that were supposed to be shredded." He still didn't speak. "I also found the drawer, logs, and the payout, dated 3 days before Evan vanished." That made his eyes flick upward, only for a moment. Adam leaned forward. "What happened that day?" "Start talking." Finally, Vance exhaled, long and slow, like letting go of a breath he'd been holding for decades. "I didn't know what was in the drawer," he said quietly. "I swear to you, I didn't." Adam waited. "I was told to seal it. That's all. Drawer 18. The order came from upstairs. Operations, they said it was already cleared. Biohazard." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I thought it was a stillborn, maybe. Some waste from surgery. That's what they told me. Do your job, Arthur. Don't ask questions." "So I did. You signed off." He nodded, barely. "I signed off because they paid me more than usual. It wasn't hush money, not outright. Just a hazard bonus. A one-time payout." Adam stopped the interrogation. He knew Vance still wasn't telling the truth. But he will, eventually. He'll make sure of it. By evening, Vance had been formally detained under suspicion of conspiracy to destroy public records, obstruction of justice, and tampering with death certificates. Adam wasn't sure how much would stick, but it was enough to hold him and, more importantly, enough to subpoena additional parties. Back at his desk, he scanned through Finch's name again, now circled in red on his whiteboard. He'd dodged every question, parried every probe, but the initials were on Evan's notes. His name was on his father's incident report, and he had overseen the patient roster the night Evan vanished. Adam picked up the phone and dialed. "I need to file for a second warrant," he said. "This time for Dr. Alistair Finch." He hung up and stared at Evan's photo again. The confident young man with a cautious smile and direct eyes. This wasn't just about a cold case anymore. It was about every name in that folder. And it was time. To pull the next thread, Adam started with the names in Evan's notebook, the ones marked with X's, former patients of Northwood, who had reportedly declined treatment or gone into unexplained decline after routine procedures. Most had died in the early OH, but he could still track their families. The first was Ruth Landry, daughter of Carl Landry, a retired postman who died after routine observation for vertigo. Ruth lived in a quiet duplex in Crestview and didn't hesitate to talk. "I remember he said no to something," she recalled. "Some drug they wanted to try. He didn't like the sound of it, said the doctor got tense when he refused." Adam asked for the records. "They never sent them," Ruth said. We asked for months. They said they were misplaced. We eventually gave up. Next came the son of Teresa Aguilar, who died in 2005 of complications from mild pneumonia. He said a similar thing. They pressured her into signing something, he said. Then she got worse. We couldn't get her out. In all, Adam spoke to 5 families. Each one described an escalating pattern, aggressive treatment suggestions, mounting pressure, to participate in special care, and then sudden deterioration. Records missing, autopsy requests denied, all under the oversight of the same attending physician, Dr. Alistair Finch. That evening, Adam received an email from an encrypted address, no reply, at burnmail.org. I was an intern at Northwood in 2005. I know what you're working on. He was running something off the books. We all knew it, but said nothing. I saved one memo. Attached was a scan, grainy but legible. 2. A Finch from our Kendall subject. Case study cohorts. 3rd round begins this week. Initial subjects responded. Poorly to prior compound. I've logged retractions under the June intake ledger. Recommend expanding sample set. Include high-risk patients lacking legal representation, especially elderly and indigent. Proceed under compensated discretion. Adam. Read the memo twice, bile rising in his throat. It was a paper trail of moral collapse. The phrases no representation and compensated discretion were thin veils over something darker: experimentation on vulnerable patients, unconsented trials, a private study masked as routine care. Finch hadn't just overseen unethical conduct. He'd signed off on it. At the archives of Bridgeport University Medical College, where Evan had studied and later lectured part-time, Adam found his academic file. A few routine student evaluations, some peer reviews, but one entry stood out. A scheduled ethics review meeting dated June 30th, 2005, one day after Evan's last known shift. The topic listed: data irregularities and non-consensual medication usage among geriatric inpatients at Northwood General Hospital. The meeting had been cancelled. No reschedule, but the timing was damning. Evan had planned to report the malpractice, and someone made sure he never got the chance. By late afternoon, Adam returned to Bridgeport. He intended to question Finch directly. He had enough circumstantial evidence to press him, even without a formal warrant yet. He arrived at his condominium, same as before, but the concierge at the desk looked nervous when he asked. Dr. Finch left in a rush this morning, he said. Took 2 suitcases. Didn't leave a return time. Adam took the elevator up anyway. His unit was empty. Drawers left open, closet doors ajar. The desk had been cleared of files. Even his framed certificates were missing from the walls. But the computer was still there, unplugged and boxed. He radioed it in, Rossi requesting alert. Suspect Dr. Alistair Finch is attempting to flee jurisdiction. Possible destruction of evidence. Need eyes on highways and local airports. 20 minutes later, a patrol officer nearby reported a vehicle, matching Finch's heading southbound on I-5, well above the speed limit. Adam jumped into his cruiser and joined the pursuit. The black Lexus veered between cars with erratic speed. Patrol units flanked both sides, sirens blazing. Adam kept his distance, watching from the rear with the dashcam rolling. He recognized the silhouette behind the wheel. No passenger. Finch exited near Westgate, blew through a red light, and kept going. His tires clipped the curb of a turning lane, and he swerved back onto the road just as a construction barrier came into view. Too fast, Adam muttered under his breath. The Lexus struck the outer curb and skidded sideways. The rear wheels lost traction, and the car flipped once, then landed on its side. scraping along the asphalt before grinding to a stop. Officers swarmed in. Finch tried to crawl through the shattered passenger side, face bloodied and hands trembling. He made it halfway out before an officer pinned him to the pavement. Adam arrived seconds later. Inside the wrecked car, he found a briefcase. Inside, a burner phone, several printed documents, and a flash drive. One paper caught his eye. A bank ledger listing offshore transactions between 2005 and 2008. The deposits were substantial. The senders, pharmaceutical subsidiaries linked to experimental compound testing. Another folder contained faded letters, correspondences with Apex Bioresearch, a now defunct research group, notorious for circumventing medical ethics boards during its brief operation in the early OOS. It was over. Back at the station, Adam laid out the evidence on the table. Evan's notes, the anonymous memo, the offshore statements, and the email chains recovered from Finch's flash drive. The DA approved a warrant by midnight. Finch, still in a hospital, gown with dried blood at his temple, sat in a holding room with 2 deputies flanking him. When Adam entered, he didn't lift his head. "You're being charged with medical fraud, conspiracy, and involuntary manslaughter," he said. "Additional charges pending review of your financial ties." He raised his eyes tired flat. Adam waited. He said nothing. Then finally, he whispered. He was going to ruin everything. Not an apology, not a denial, just that. Adam turned and walked out, but he didn't feel victory. He felt the full weight of 17 years of silence, cracked open, by a man who never got to speak for himself. The interview room was cold. Vance sat alone, staring at the table with fingers folded tightly. A legal aid attorney sat beside him, nervous, young, quiet. Adam entered with a court recorder and a signed agreement in hand. Reduced sentencing, in exchange for a full confession and cooperation. "This is your chance," he said. "Tell the truth, all of it." Vance didn't speak right away, but eventually he nodded. The words came slowly, like something he hadn't said aloud, not even to himself. "It was Finch," he began. "That night, after the confrontation, he came down to the morgue. Said Evan had caused a scene. Said he was unraveling, that he needed calming down." Adam remained still. He handed me a vial of midazolam and a syringe. Told me to settle him down until he could figure things out. I didn't ask questions. I just followed orders. He exhaled, visibly shaking now. He was unconscious in under 2 minutes. And then, Adam asked. I wheeled him down to the morgue. He told me which drawer, number 18. Told me to put him in there. Said it was just temporary, that he'd wake up and be reassigned. Adam leaned forward, but he didn't wake up. Vance nodded, eyes watery. I checked the next morning. He was dead, and he said we couldn't go back, that the drawer had to stay sealed. According to Vance, the timing was perfect for them, at least. Shortly after, the hospital shut down several sections due to an asbestos contamination. Warning: maintenance cleared the wing of staff and sealed it off for safety reasons. The morgue went quiet, unused, untouched. Finch said we'd use the closure as cover, Vance said. Told me to handle it. I changed the morgue logs, marked the drawer as containing medical waste that had been cleared. No one double-checked. He stared at his hands. I added a seal to the drawer, bolted it shut. Told the others it had been decontaminated and logged. Nobody questioned it. Everyone was trying to get out of there. Adam felt a deep chill move through him. You knew he was in there, he said. He nodded slowly. I kept telling myself it wasn't. My fault, that I didn't mean for him to die, that I was just doing what I was told. But every year, it got heavier. He looked up at him. I thought maybe the building would be torn down. Maybe they'd never find him. but part of me knew it was just a matter of time. The press conference was held at City Hall 2 days later. A row of microphones lined the dais, with local media and national outlets gathered in force. Behind the podium stood the district attorney, the mayor, and Adam's captain. Adam remained in the back of the room, arms folded, watching quietly as the DA took the mic. "After 16 years, we can finally begin to speak the truth," he began. Dr. Evan Reed, who was previously considered a missing person, has now been identified as the victim of medical conspiracy and homicide. His death was covered up in connection with unauthorized human experimentation conducted under the guise of legitimate patient care at Northwood General Hospital. Gasps echoed through the room. "We are now pursuing formal charges against multiple individuals involved, including Dr. Alistair Finch, who is currently in custody. Investigations are ongoing." Adam said nothing, his eyes fixed on the photo now. Projected behind the speakers, Evan Reed in his white coat, smiling confidently on the hospital steps. He had been buried not just in a morgue drawer, but in silence, in inaction, in bureaucracy. But not anymore. It started with quiet resignations. 3 days after Finch's arrest, the Medical Review Board issued a public statement acknowledging that procedural oversights and regulatory failures contributed to a culture of unmonitored research practices at Northwood General Hospital. Between 2002 and 2008, buried in the language was a list of former board members and research liaison names that now appeared in Finch's archived correspondences and internal memos. 2 former board members stepped down from active teaching roles at private universities. Another was subpoenaed for testimony regarding funding links between Northwood and Apex Bioresearch. By the end of the week, 3 hospitals in the region voluntarily reopened their own ethics reviews, scanning for patterns similar to those that had emerged from Evan's notes. The city's largest university hospital removed Finch's name from their donor wall. What once seemed buried in an outdated archive had triggered the unraveling of an entire professional network. Adam found himself at a community center auditorium on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, standing before a gathering of families he had come to know by name: Ruth Landry, Miguel Aguilar, Annette Shields. Each had brought faded records and photocopied death certificates. Many had never questioned what happened to their loved ones until now. The hall buzzed with quiet grief and new anger. A civil rights attorney named Leah Brown addressed them, first outlining the structure of the class action suit: wrongful death, conspiracy to defraud, institutional negligence. Then she introduced Adam. He hadn't planned to speak, but they turned to him expectantly. He stepped forward. "I didn't know how deep this would go when we found him," he began, "but I want you to know, we didn't stop." Evan Reed died trying to expose what happened. "This case isn't just his anymore, it's yours too." Afterwards, several family members approached him. "Thank you," Ruth whispered, clutching Adam's hand. "You gave us something to fight with." The sentencing hearing came 3 weeks later. The courtroom was quieter this time. Fewer cameras, no opening statements, just the gavel, the victims' families seated in heavy silence, and the 2 men in suits seated far apart. Vance in subdued grey, Finch in his navy blue, thinner now. Judge Palmer addressed the court, his tone measured but resolute. "To Mr. Arthur Vance," he said, "you are found guilty of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and criminal negligence contributing to involuntary manslaughter. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in state prison with eligibility for parole in 7. The court notes your cooperation in revealing the broader conspiracy." Vance closed his eyes but said nothing. Adam didn't look at him. To Dr. Alistair Finch, the judge continued, "You are found guilty of conspiracy to commit medical fraud, multiple counts of unauthorized human experimentation, and second-degree murder in the death of Dr. Evan Reed. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Finch lifted his eyes toward the bench for the first time since his arrest. His expression faltered not remorse, not confusion, just the realization that the system he once manipulated had turned, at last, against him. No applause followed, no gasp, only the sound of the gavel striking wood and the slow shuffle of chairs as the courtroom began to empty. 2 weeks later, Adam returned to the construction site where it had all begun. The old hospital was gone now, reduced to a flattened lot of damp soil and caution tape. Excavators sat still under the grey sky. He stood under his umbrella, staring out across the space. This was where Evan had worked, where he had fought, recorded, resisted. This was where his own father had died. For a long time, Adam said nothing. He let the silence stretch, broken only by the wind shifting through the chain-link fence and the soft tap of rain against gravel. He thought of the years that had passed, of all the unanswered questions, the quiet wrongs that had never made, the news. He thought of Evan, alone in that cold drawer, his notes unfinished. Of his father, in that bed, slowly fading after saying no to a treatment no one had explained. The city would build something new here. Another name, another purpose. But Adam would remember what had come before. The pain buried beneath paperwork, the truths that nearly stayed hidden, and the people who never stopped resisting, whether anyone noticed or not. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. May you rest in peace. And so, our story comes to a close. May your mind be calm and your dreams be sweet. Good night, don't now let the sound of the rain soothe you to sleep.